This is a hard drive. Well, actually, this is a very old ATA 80 gigabyte hard drive. And the reason I'm using an old hard drive is because this is the outside of the hard drive, and this is the inside. In this episode, Hard Drives, we're going to be talking about this wonderful technology that's been around for decades, that has been the primary form of mass storage for PCs for, well, pretty much since the beginning. Now, before we get too far into this, I want to get some terms down. In particular, the term hard drive. A hard drive, or as CompTIA calls it, a magnetic drive, or as I still call it, a spindle drive, is this type of technology where we have some form of rotational media. In this case, it's these beautiful platters, and these platters actually store the data, a little bit of magnetism, and then we have that little voice coil read-write head going back and forth, which is both reading and writing data on the fly. Now, if we take a look at the other side of this hard drive, what you're going to see is a bunch of electronics. And this is the actual controller for the hard drive itself. So there's a term I want to get into your head right now, and that is IDE, or Integrated Drive Electronics. If you hear the term IDE, or sometimes you'll even hear EIDE, these are kind of old-fashioned terms that define almost any hard drive that has a built-in controller, and pretty much all hard drives have a built-in controller, so technically every hard drive in existence is IDE. Now that I've told you that, don't use that term. What these drives are ATA. That ATA standard that's used to be the language to talk to hard drives is also a standard in terms of connections, data speed, all kinds of stuff. So the ATA standard covers all kinds of things, including how we talk to these drives. So if you want to be proper, the term is ATA drives. Now, ATA drives have been around like forever. So as you can imagine, with any technology, things change and get better. The first generation of ATA drives were these old geezers. This is what's known as parallel ATA, or PATA. They use these 40-pin connectors, and they had this little 40-pin plug-in right here, and they had bizarre terms like master and slave connection. These things are now obsolete. If you actually find a computer that has these kind of connections in it, odds are probably pretty good you should be considering a new computer. When we're talking about ATA today, what we're talking about is serial ATA, or SATA. I've got some right here. Now, if we take a look at this guy, this is a serial ATA connector. You'll see that there are two little connectors there. The little tiny one is actually the data connector. The larger one is for power. It's kind of interesting, the power connector is actually larger than the data connector. Well, that's SATA for you. Now, we've got a couple of different sizes here, so what I want to do is show you the two different sizes of drives. So I've got, at the bottom, I've got a 3.5-inch drive, and here on top, I've got a 2.5-inch drive. Now, if you look very carefully, one thing you're going to notice is that the connectors are absolutely identical. So the 2.5-inch drive is going to be a little bit more common in, say, laptops, and the 3.5-inch drive you'll see more often in desktops. But other than that, from a technology standpoint, they are both SATA. All right. Now, what I want to do next is let's go ahead and do some plugging in. So what I have here is a SATA cable. Now, SATA cables can be up to 1 meter long, but you usually see them around 18 inches as a more common size. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my SATA drive, and I've got a motherboard here with SATA connections, and let's get this thing all plugged in. So the first thing I want to do is try to find a SATA connection. On this particular motherboard, it's pretty easy because I've got one SATA connection here, and then I got 6 more here. We will talk about where to plug it in other episodes, but for right now, let's just go ahead and plug it into that SATA connection right there. So if I take a look, the SATA has that little L shape, so it's really kind of hard to plug it in wrong. I've done it, but I'm very strong, like bull. And then on this side, I'm going to go ahead, and there's my data connection there. And hold still, there we go. And so I've got that all plugged in. The next part of the process is power. So this is a big old SATA cable that came from a modular power supply. So normally I'd plug this into a power supply on this end, but here I've got a whole bunch of SATA connectors. This is really great if you got a whole bunch of SATA drives. And it's also really great for showing you guys how to plug SATA power in. So there's my SATA power connector. Now it has an L shape also, so it's impossible to plug it in backwards unless you are very strong. And that is plugged in and ready to go. So from a plugging in standpoint, SATA is really pretty trivial. It just plugs in, and assuming you've got it plugged in and you've got power, it usually should go. All right, so SATA has been around for a while, and as you might imagine, there are other versions of SATA. And when I talk about that, I mean in terms of connections. So the first thing I want to talk about is what we call eSATA. eSATA, for external SATA, is really more customized for external, so external hard drives and things like that. Now, let me get this mess unplugged here. And what I want to show you is on this motherboard right here, is that it actually has an eSATA connection on it. So you see that connection right there? That is my eSATA. So what I'm going to do is, if you take a look at this eSATA cable, it has the basic size of a regular SATA cable, but it's designed for external devices. See if I get it right. I never get that right the first time. It's just luck. There we go. And now I've got my external SATA plugged in. I love external SATA. I use it for drive duplicators and external hard drives, all kinds of stuff like that. Keep in mind, the beauty of eSATA is it's designed for hot pluggability, so we can plug it in and unplug it whenever we need. All right, now the third type of connector I want to talk about is mSATA or microSATA. mSATA is a really, really tiny connector. It's just an alternative to SATA. And I've got a copy of the mSATA right. Hey, who took my mSATA? Don't have an mSATA on me? Here's a picture of one. We use mSATAs for hard drives that are mounted directly to motherboards. We see them in laptops a lot. But an mSATA is, again, just another alternative to SATA. Okay, so make sure you can recognize those three different types of connectors. Now, not only have the connectors changed and been updated over the years, but also SATA itself, the standard, which has been around now for, well, since around 2004, 2003, 2004, it keeps getting faster and faster. So what I want to do right now is go through the different SATA versions, because you're going to see it on the test. The first SATA was called SATA 1. It came out back in 2003 and ran at 1.5 gigabits per second. Next was SATA 2. It came out just about a year later in 2004, doubling the speed to 3 gigabits per second and adding a couple of interesting features, in particular something called native command queuing. Native command queuing kind of works like this. On a regular hard drive, you have a number of requests coming in for pieces of data. So in this example, we'll say we have 4 different sectors that are being requested. Now normally, these are asked in the order that the requests come in. So 1, 2, 3, 4. But in order to get these 4 sectors, we're going to have to completely rotate the hard drive a number of times to get them. Native command queuing allows the hard drive to rearrange the order so that the hard drive can minimize the number of rotations necessary to get the data. So in this case, we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, greatly reducing the number of rotations necessary to grab the data. 2004 was an interesting year for SATA in that eSATA first came out. eSATA, which you've already seen the connector for, has a couple of interesting features. First of all, eSATA in and of itself doesn't provide power. eSATA devices are going to have their own power source. Secondly, eSATA can run at any speed that a regular SATA device can. So if you have a SATA 1 capable motherboard, then the eSATA is going to run at SATA 1 speeds. If you have a SATA 2 capable motherboard, then it's going to run at SATA 2 speeds. And also keep in mind that the maximum cable length for eSATA is 2 meters, not 1 as we would see with regular SATA. Now the third version of SATA to come along, back in 2009, is SATA 3. SATA 3 runs at a blistering 6 gigabits per second and adds a large number of features and is currently the common and popular version of SATA. The downside to having all of these newer versions of SATA come along is that you need to make sure the system will take advantage of these new features. So to do that, we have a feature built into your system itself called Advanced Host Controller Interface, or AHCI, or some people even say ACHI. Anyway, what you need to do is you need to go into your system setup and you have to make sure that AHCI is actually turned on. Even the latest version of Windows will not take advantage of this unless this is turned on at first. So let me show you what that looks like in a typical BIOS. Okay, now on this particular BIOS, I'm going to have to dig around for a minute, and there it is, SATA configuration, and looky here. On this particular BIOS, it calls it SATA mode selection, and if I click on this, you'll see I get two options, either ACHI or RAID. So I can set up the ATA controllers here to be ACHI, or I can set them up to be RAID controllers, and we'll talk about RAID controllers in another episode. On older BIOSes, you'll see a third option, and it'll say, usually says like IDE or something like that. And you'll have a choice between either ACHI or IDE. And IDE basically means turn off ACHI. Okay, so it's really important that AHCI is turned on by default. Here in the office, we're having a big argument over, do most BIOSes have AHCI turned on by default? I say no, other people say yes. Play it safe. When you get a new system, make sure it's turned on. Oh, and by the way, if you have an established system where Windows is already installed and you go into your system setup and you see that it's set to IDE or SATA or something, and then you go, oh, I'm going to turn on AHCI. That is a really bad idea. Most of the time when you do that, it's going to require you to completely reinstall the operating system. So if it's not already turned on, don't turn it on unless you want to do a whole bunch of work. All right, so those are all the basics of installing SATA. So what I want to do next is I want to go through the actual process of installing a SATA drive. So I'm going to bring in another system, we're going to get it all set up, we're going to get it plugged in, and let's talk about one really important point, and that's how do you deal with all the different ports. Okay guys, so we're putting it all together here. Now, I've got my system up and cooking. Now this is an existing Windows system. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding a hard drive to a system that already has a hard drive. Let me show you what I mean. So this hard drive right here, this is the one that's always been in here. This is my C drive. It's got Windows. It boots up into Windows. It works great. But what I've done here is I've added a second drive. And if you look, you can actually see I got a different colored SATA cable there, so you can see that it's a different cable coming in. Now, I have a bunch of connectors back here to plug it into. So I actually took a little time and I checked the motherboard book and it said I could plug it into any of them, so I'm in good shape there. So physically, that's pretty much all I had to do. So the challenge we're running into now is that if I've got it all plugged in right, well, how do I know it's right? Well, your first step is to go into your system setup. So let's go ahead, I'm going to reboot this system right now, and let's check out my drives in system setup. So here I am in my system setup, and I've got to poke around here a little bit, and here it is. Every one of these is different. You're always going to have to try to figure out, but somewhere it's going to talk about your boot options. And if you take a look here, you'll see that there are two devices. One says WDC, that's a Western Digital hard drive, and the other one says Sony DVD, that's my DVD drive. And it's saying I'm going to boot from the hard drive, and then I'll boot from the DVD. Now, what I want to see is where is that second hard drive, and on this particular system setup, I've got to go down to this particular option, hard drive BBS priorities. Yours will probably say something different. And it gives me a quick list of all the different hard drives on this system. And now I can clearly see here is my other hard drive. So 2 hard drives are here. This system is ready to rock and roll. All right, so the system sees both of the hard drives, so that's good. Now, the last step I want to do is I want to actually boot up Windows. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up Windows, and once we get Windows up and cooking, we're going to fire up disk management. And hopefully disk management will see the new drive. Ta-da! Okay, here we are in disk management, and if you take a look, you can see both drives. Now here's this top one here is my existing hard drive that's got Windows installed on it. You can see it's the C drive, everything's great. But if you see this other one, that is my new drive. So Windows sees it. The only downside is that it's not really quite ready to go because we still haven't partitioned it and formatted it. Partitioning and formatting is important, but we're going to save that for other episodes.